Hi, welcome to my channel and thank you to my subscribers. If you have not already subscribed to this channel, please subscribe. In this video, we are going to see how to configure ForgeRock Access Management as a SAML Identity Provider in AWS Cognito. In the previous videos, we have seen how to do similar configurations using different identity providers like Azure AD, Okta, Auth0, and Keycloak. So we are going to do something similar here using ForgeRock Access Management as the SAML identity provider. So before getting into the configuration steps, I will explain the end-to-end flow on how this federation will work between Cognito and ForgeRock. So when the user tries to access the client application in the browser, the client application will do a redirect to Cognito. So assuming the user has not logged in already to the client application, there won't be any authentication session in the client application. So it will do a redirect to Amazon Cognito using OpenID Connect authorization code grant flow. And Cognito will display a login page with a button. And when the user clicks the button, it will start a SAML federation with ForgeRock Access Management. And ForgeRock will then display the login page, and the user needs to enter the ForgeRock AM user credentials, and if the credentials are valid, ForgeRock will post a SAML assertion back to Cognito. Cognito will create a new local profile in its own user pool if it doesn't exist. If it already exists, it will just update the attribute values if there are any changes. And once that is done, Cognito will return the authorization code in the step number 9 to the client application, and this is a browser redirect. And the client application can then use the authorization code to make a backend API call to the token endpoint of Cognito and get the access token, ID token, and refresh token. And based on the claims in the ID token and access token, the client application can either allow or deny access to that particular user to this client application. So this is the end-to-end flow. And during my demo, instead of using the authorization code grant flow in the step number 2, I will be using the implicit flow just for the purpose of demo. But please don't use implicit flow for your production applications because it is a deprecated grant flow, and most probably it will get removed from the spec in the future because it is not at all secure. But from a demo point of view, it is easier to understand, and that is the reason why I'm using it. But don't use it for any of your production applications. So now let's get into the configuration steps, and I'm going to use the AWS Management Console for creating the Cognito user pool and then configuring the ForgeRock AM as the identity provider. And I have a local instance of ForgeRock AM running in my Tomcat server. I am not going to get into the steps of how to configure AM in your local machine. You can follow the documentation, the getting started documentation on how to download the WAR file, set up the Tomcat server, the Java, JDK, all those things, and then deploy the WAR file and then configure this AM server. But the AM server that I'm using, it's a new installation. So the only realm that you see is the top level realm, and I'm going to create some new realm just for the purpose of this demo. So now let's get into the configuration steps. The very first step is to create a user pool with the bare minimum configuration, which is required for this demo. So let's quickly go through those steps. When you get to the first screen of the create user pool, select username, go to the next screen, leave these options as is except this MFA. Like you don't need MFA in this case, so disable it. We don't need all these options. For the purpose of demo, you can always explore it later. Again, we don't need these options, so disable all these options and leave this required attributes for now. We can configure the attribute mapping when we add the SAML identity provider in Cognito. and select this option just to get to the next screen. And now enter a pool name. I'm going to enter it as CogFR, which basically means Cognito and ForgeRock. Select the Cognito hosted UI option, and please don't forget to select this option because hosted UI is mandatory for external identity provider configuration. And now we need to set a domain. So I'm going to set it as cogfr1. And you need to create a client during the user pool creation. So I'm going to create a client called cogfr client, select the generate secret option, and I'm going to add jwt.io as the redirect URL. And this is a standard website that I use for all my demos because it is easier to show the decoded ID token values. And this website automatically decodes the ID token that is passed in the URL and it displays in the UI. And that is the reason why I use that implicit flow. And that is the next step that we are going to do. That is basically remove the authorization code grant flow and add implicit grant flow. And as I said earlier, it is not a very secure flow. It is okay for the purpose of demo to understand how the end-to-end flow works, but don't use it in your production applications. And for the OpenID Connect scopes, we don't need phone. So let's just have OpenID profile and email. And we can go to the next screen, review all the configurations, and create the user pool. So the user pool creation is done. You can review all the configurations by navigating through these tabs. But the main values are present in this app integration tab where you can see the domain which I configured and the application client that I created during the user pool creation. So the user pool creation is done. We need to still configure the SAML Identity Provider in this user pool. But before that, we need to make some config changes on the ForgeRock side. So once we are done with that, we can come back to the screen and configure the SAML Identity Provider. So now let's go to the ForgeRock access management screen and create a new realm. I will name it as Cognito since we are setting up a demo with Cognito. So what we are going to do here is actually configure the SAML service provider, which is Cognito in this case, in the ForgeRock AM, which is the identity provider in this case, and then create a test user. And once that is done, we will go back to the Cognito screen, download the IDP metadata from ForgeRock Access Manager and configure it in Cognito. So in order to configure the Cognito service provider, you can follow this documentation. Like there are multiple steps involved. It might be confusing when you go through the documentation for the very first time, and that is the reason why I'm adding this demo video. There are multiple steps involved, so I will go through these steps. I'm not going to go through this document, but you can always refer it later. So the first step in order to configure a service provider is create a circle of trust. So I'm going to name it as Cognito COT. And you can leave all these things as is and save changes. So the circle of trust got created. The next step is to create a hosted identity provider for this particular realm. So add hosted identity provider and then give an entity name. I'm going to name it as login.forgerock.com/cognito. And for the IDP alias, I'm going to name it as IDP. And for SP, I'm going to name it as SP. And circle of trust will be that Cognito code, which I created in the previous step. So now we have the hosted identity provider already created for this AM realm. The next step is to configure the Cognito service provider, basically the SAML service provider, which in this case is Cognito. So in order to add a remote service provider, AM actually expects a metadata file. But the problem here is Cognito doesn't have a URL where you can download the metadata. So I'm going to create the metadata file from scratch using some tools. I will go through these steps. So first, go to the documentation of Cognito user pool on how to add a SAML identity provider. So you can go to this documentation, scroll up, go to this particular section which talks about adding a sign-in identity provider. Sign in through a third-party identity provider and go to SAML providers. And here you can see some values like what will be the assertion consumer service URL for a user pool, what will be the entity ID of a user pool. So now let's create the metadata file from scratch using this SAML tools website. So I generally use this website. If there is no metadata file, it's a very handy website to create a metadata file. So go to this build metadata section, SP. The mandatory values are entity ID and assertion consumer service URL. So let's copy it and put it here. And then let's replace the values based on my user pool ID and domain. So the user pool ID comes from my user pool, which is this one. Copy it and put it here. So in your case, it will be a different value because it is a unique identifier across all the user pools. And the ACS, which is the assertion consumer service endpoint, domain will be the domain that I created. In your case, it will be a different domain. Again, it's a unique identifier, like a unique domain for each user pool across all the accounts. So these are the two mandatory values. And now let's click the build SP metadata. So now we got the metadata file. Now copy this metadata file and save it as XML. So I'm using this online SAML editor. The only reason XML editor. The only reason I'm using this is just to show the values. So you can see the different elements here. So this is the entity ID that you see here. And this is the assertion consumer URL that I configured. So now let's download this file. So the file got downloaded. Now click this area and it will automatically open the file finder, and you can select that file, select the Cognito code as the circle of trust and create. So the service provider got created, which is the SAML service provider. Now we need to go inside this service provider and make some config changes. So the very first thing that we need to do is add the list of attributes that needs to be posted in the SAML assertion. So we need at least the basic attributes like email, first name, last name, and full name of the user. So I'm going to add all those attributes here. And the SAML attribute is the attribute name, which will be present in the SAML assertion. And the local attribute is the attribute name which is used in the identity store. So if you go to this identity store, embedded, and user configuration, you can see the list of user attribute names. So if you search for, say, SN, so you can see SN, which is the last name, and then you can search for CN, which is the full name, and then you can search for given name, and then there is a mail. So I'm going to configure these 4 attributes there. So if you go back to that screen, assertion processing. So let's configure one by one attribute. So the SAML attribute name in the assertion will be mail, local attribute name is mail, and the next one is given name, and the local attribute name is given name, and the SAML attribute will be last name, but the local attribute name is SN, which is basically surname in LDAP terms, and then name, which will be the full name, and its CN in LDAP. So I have added all these 4 attributes. Now save the changes. Don't forget to save the changes, otherwise whatever you config changes you did here will get lost. So this step is done. The next step is we have to make one more change. So if you go to this IDP configuration and scroll down, you will see the name ID value map. So when the service provider posts a SAML request, like sends the SAML authentication request to the identity provider, which in this case is AM, and if the name ID value is email address, then the value that will be sent in the subject, SAML subject, will be mail. But in the case of Cognito, it uses unspecified name ID format. So we need to add a mapping for this unspecified name ID value. I'm going to use the same mail attribute. So add that. And again, don't forget to save the changes. So the service provider configuration is done. The identity provider configuration is done. Now we need to create a test user. So let's create a test user. I will name it as cog test user 1. You can set any random password. And let's set a fake email address like example.com. Create. And we need to add the first name, the last name, and the full name. And again, don't forget to save the changes. So the configuration on the ForgeRock AM side is done. The next step is to add the identity provider, that is the SAML Identity Provider in Cognito. So now go to the Sign In Experience tab in the Cognito user pool and select Add Identity Provider and select SAML, and you can give any name. I am just going to name it as ForgeRock AM. So it asks for a metadata document. So now let's see how to get that metadata document from ForgeRock. So if you search for openam export IDP metadata, the very first link actually explains how to get the IDP metadata from AM. That is basically how to download it. There are multiple ways. You can use curl command, SSO ADM command. So I'm going to use this URL and then replace the values. So the server URL in my case is login.forgerock.com:8080/openam. So I'm going to copy that and replace it. And then the entity ID is the one that I created here. So if you remember, I created a login.forgerock.com/cognito as the identity provider, and that is the entity ID. So I'm going to replace this entity ID here. And the rel name is Cognito. If you remember, the very first step that we did in AM is create this rel. So I got the metadata document here. So you can view the IDP metadata. So let's actually save this metadata. So view page source, save as Forge openam IDP metadata 1.xml. So the metadata document is saved. Now go back to this Cognito user pool, upload that file that you saved in the previous step. And now let's do the attribute mapping. So if you remember, we configured 4 different attributes like email. We named it as mail. So if you remember, if you go back to this step and assertion processing, there are 4 attributes, SAML attributes that we configured: mail, given name, last name, and name. So I'm going to map that SAML attribute to the local user pool attribute name. So it is mail, given name. The SAML attribute name is given name. and sorry, name, it is name, and here it is called family name, and I added it as last name. So add this identity provider. So the identity provider is now configured. The next step that we need to do is go to the client that we created in the user during the user pool creation and enable this identity provider for this client so that users from ForgeRock Access Manager can access this client. Now save the changes. So the end-to-end configuration is now done. The next step is to test this end-to-end configuration. So copy this view hosted UI link, like right click and copy it. And I'm using Mozilla now for testing because I use Chrome for all the configurations. I don't want the sessions to get confused. So I will now access this URL. And when I click ForgeRock AM, you can see the SAML authentication request that is getting posted to the ForgeRock AM. Now I'm going to log in using that user that I created, cog test user 1, and the password. So let's see if I'm able to log in. Yes, so I was able to log in, and you can see the ID token that is generated from Cognito, and you can see the given name, you can see the family name, you can see the email, you can see the name, which is Cognito test user 1, and you can see all these values in the SAML assertion that is getting posted back from ForgeRock AM to Cognito. So if you look at this SAML attribute statements, you can see the name, last name, mail, and given name. So let's just see one more thing. Like I will modify this Cognito test users. Let's say I will modify the last name as Cognito, like a test user last name, and I will name this as cog test user 1. Save changes. Let's see if the values are getting modified here. But before doing that, let's go to the Cognito user pool and see the user profile that got created here. So the local user profile that got created in Cognito has a prefix ForgeRock AM, which is the identifier ID that I provided when I created this SAML identity provider. And you can see the email, family name, given name, name, all these values here. So now I modified some of these values in the identity provider. So let's go back to the screen. So we need to clear the cookies, otherwise it's going to reuse the same Cognito session and you won't get the updates. So I'm going to log in again. Let's go to ForgeRock AM and I'm going to use that same user. And now let's see what happens. So you can see the new values got updated. Family name updated to test user last name updated to cog test user 1. You can see the same things here as well in the SAML assertion. All the latest values got posted. Now if you come and refresh the screen, you should see all these family name and name getting changed. Let's check it actually. Oh, it already changed even before I refreshed. That is really good. So even before I refreshed, it already changed. So just to see how it got refreshed, even I'm not sure how it got refreshed. Let's just change it again. Test user SN, save changes, go back to Mozilla, clear the cookies, and again log in. Log in here as cog test user 1. So you can see the changes here which says test user SN, and when I come here to the Cognito screen, oh, it already modified. That's great. Even without refreshing the page, it gets modified, which is really great. So This is the end-to-end configuration for Cognito ForgeRock AM SAML Federation. So it involves multiple steps, and you might surely face issues when you start doing the configuration. You can always come back and review the video again, or you can post your questions in the comments and I will be happy to answer. I hope you enjoyed this video. So post your comments or questions. Thank you for watching and please subscribe. Thank you.